back to Science Sundays. I'm John Beacom from Physics and Astronomy. I'm the chair of the Science Sundays committee. I represent a committee of about 8 people from across the arts and sciences. I see some of them here. The College of Arts and Sciences prioritizes sharing the results of the research that its faculty do. And this is one of the ways we do it. Another way we do it is through classroom teaching. But why are we doing this? What brings you, the audience, and us, the faculty, together? It's really 2 things. One is curiosity, a shared sense of curiosity about the world and how it works. And the other sense is a sense of community, enjoying to share knowledge with others. And we're all into that, so here we are. So today's speaker, we're very lucky to have, is Sophia Chen. Sophia is a journalist who lives here in Columbus. She has written for Wired, MIT Technology Review, Nature, and the popular YouTube series Physics Girl. She was also a Simons communicator in residence?
Yes.
There we go. At Berkeley?
Yes.
At Berkeley, okay. We're really lucky to have her, and let's welcome her.
Hello, everybody. So I'm just gonna, okay, my mic is, how's the volume levels? Very good? Okay, all right. Well, I'm very excited to be giving this talk today. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, John, for the introduction. As John said, I am a journalist. My background is in physics, and I've been writing about science and technology for about 10 years now. And so today we are here to talk about the technology known as generative AI. And so generative AI includes things like ChatGPT by OpenAI, Gemini by Google, Meta has Meta AI, Anthropic has Claude. And so these are things that you've probably seen. You give it a prompt, it produces some text, maybe an image. So I just also wanted to clarify that generative AI is a specific type of AI. I'm going to be calling it generative AI, Gen AI, maybe just AI. But just know that when I say AI, I mean generative AI, and actually there are other types of artificial intelligence other than generative AI. And so I'm specifically talking about this technology that the companies are really pushing on us right now, and that governments are really going all in over. And so I guess before I get into the talk, I just wanted to see a show of hands. How many people in here would say that they use generative AI on a regular basis? Okay, a fair number of people, but not everybody. So I wanted to open my talk with an example of generative AI. So this is me using Claude by Anthropic. I asked it to generate a title slide for this talk. Let's see how it does. OK, this is taking a while. OK, there we go. So this is my title slide for this talk. I would say it's not my favorite, but I didn't iterate on it, and I also was using the free version. So this is I kind of asked for it. So in addition to being able to make images for your PowerPoint, people are using generative AI in all sorts of ways already. So here are some ways. One example that I like is AlphaFold. So this is a generative AI software that can predict the 3D structure of proteins. And so this has been very useful for both basic science and for discovering new drugs for diseases. I have a lot of friends who are using it for computer coding. They say it has its limitations, but they say also that it can make it a lot faster, and so a lot of them really like it. Another example is I spoke to some people, some lawyers working at a nonprofit. So they were using ChatGPT-like software to generate basically these documents for like court petitions that are very formulaic. And so they were having lawyers review the documents after they were generated, but basically it's sped up the process of generating these documents, and they were able to lower the cost of legal fees for their clients. And then, of course, you can use it in your personal life as well. I had a friend, he basically took all of the ingredients in his pantry, he gave it to ChatGPT and said, what can I cook with this? And then it gave him a recipe for a chili. He made it, and it was fine. And of course, we are at OSU right now, and so there are students that are using this software for their assignments, both licitly and illicitly. I'll just leave that there. And then, if you use social media, you might be seeing a lot of what is known as AI slop. So it's just content that's been AI generated, just flooding people's feeds. One example from earlier this year is there were these little miniature cows. A lot of people thought they existed and they could get them as pets, but they were really just made up by AI. And I don't know what the deal is with the watermelon. That just came up with it. And then, of course, there's been a lot of coverage about people getting into relationships with AI. So I bring all these up because I wanted to make the point that a lot of people are already finding generative AI useful. It might not be the way that you want to use it, but people are finding it useful. And so the question that I want to ask in my talk is, at what cost does this utility come? And so, there are monetary costs, of course, but I specifically want to focus on the energy costs. So how much energy does AI use? And so I want to, I'll give you some numbers in the talk, but before I get into the numbers, I did want to give you some context, because sometimes when you just see numbers, sometimes you're like, how do I make sense of that? So I wanted to start by telling you about some of the media narratives I've been seeing about generative AI, and so maybe you've seen them too. So one of them is this very scary narrative where AI is this energy-guzzling disaster in waiting. So, for example, this story was about a coal power plant in Pennsylvania that had been retired, and they reopened it as a natural gas power plant to power AI. And then a couple weeks ago, the Department of Energy Secretary said that, so there are a lot of coal plants that were due to be retired, and he thinks that, he basically was saying that they're not going to be retired as scheduled, they're going to stay online because AI needs them. And so in both of these examples, these are fossil fuel plants that are remaining online, or either they're new or they're staying online longer than planned, and so these really affect companies' emission targets. So, fossil fuel plants are a major source of carbon emissions, and a lot of these companies, they several years ago set targets. They wanted to lower their carbon footprint, and they're saying that they can't meet their targets because of AI specifically. And then in addition to that, there are headlines talking about the quality of power that people are receiving in their homes. Basically, that AI is such a power suck, it's affecting the power grid. There was an analysis by Bloomberg that found that if you were close to a data center, there were distortions in the power that you received, and those distortions could damage your household electronics. So in all of these narratives, I would say AI comes across as this huge villain. It's very scary. So I wanted to look into how big of a villain really is it? And so I started to look into the numbers, and then I was presented with what I would call a counter narrative, where I found actually, so there is an independent agency based in Europe called the International Energy Agency. They released this very respected report about energy usage worldwide, and they had a special issue on AI. And in that report, they kind of laid out that globally, actually, AI doesn't use that much energy compared to other technologies. So, so in 2024, data centers accounted for 1.5% of world electricity demand. And they compared that to building cooling, so air conditioning and fans, and that was at 10%, so significantly higher. And then they projected forward, and they said, actually, they thought that electric vehicles and AC would drive more growth in electricity than data centers. And so when I saw these things, I was like, okay, so if AI is a villain, maybe it's not a very big one. And also compounding that, I would say there was this other narrative that I saw, which is that AI is really overhyped. So, so my thought was like, okay, it's really overhyped. So there are a lot of articles trying to make the case that it won't actually be that popular. So if it's not actually that popular, like, can it really be energy guzzling? And so these are some of the headlines that I saw that sort of indicated that AI is not going to be as popular as the companies want you to believe. So one is that for a lot of tasks that AI wasn't actually even that good. Some people were finding with a new release of ChatGPT that they thought that actually it's hallucinations, which are when it makes up stuff, when it says things that are lies or untrue. They saw that it was getting worse. There was this other article about how, so during finals week, all these companies were offering free access to their chatbots to students. And so they were making the comparison to Uber for millennials. So in this scenario, basically they were saying, okay, like these companies are flush with cash, they can artificially lower the price of their product, and they basically try to get people hooked on this technology, but it's actually a lot more expensive than the current price would have you believe. And so the idea being like, okay, they're undervaluing it, it's not profitable at the prices that they're offering. And then also, there are a lot of lawsuits going on. So recently, Anthropic lost a lawsuit. It has to pay $1.5 billion to settle a copyright lawsuit with authors whose content they use to train their model. Disney and Universal are suing these companies. New York Times is suing them. Reddit is suing them. And so these are really costly lawsuits. And so all of these add to the idea that, okay, like this is a bubble, like maybe it's not going to be that popular of a technology. So that brings me to the question, so like I was like, okay, which narrative is it? Like, is it a huge disaster, or like do these other factors, do they kind of counteract how big of a disaster it would be? So I guess over the course of the talk, I'm going to try to make the case that actually it's both. It's both scary and it's also overhyped, because it doesn't actually matter whether or not the technology takes off. And that's because AI's energy use is already straining local electricity infrastructure. So before I get into that, I wanted to talk about how AI uses energy. So the way AI uses energy can be categorized in 3 main steps. So first, it uses energy when you have to manufacture the chips that run the software. The second step is the step called training. So that's the one where you give it a lot of data and it learns to identify patterns. And then the last step is inference. And so inference is the step that the end user is involved in. So that's when you prompt it and ask it to make, an image for your slides or whatever for it. So I'm going to talk about each of these steps, but I also want to emphasize that, so when I mention numbers here, that actually companies have been really secretive about all three of these steps. There's actually a lot of uncertainty and unknowns in the estimates that I'm going to give you. And so a lot of the numbers that I take are from independent researchers who they have to make a lot of assumptions, and a lot of them do it based on like estimating things, like basically like a company will say like, oh, we've made this many chips, we've shipped this many or whatever, and so they have to extrapolate a lot to get these numbers. So in the chip manufacturing step, the main region to pay attention to is Taiwan. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company makes an overwhelming proportion of the world's advanced chips. I've seen this number 90%. And so Taiwan, notably, its power generation is 80% from fossil fuels. And so that's important to note because fossil fuels produce a lot of carbon emissions. And so in 2024, chip manufacturing used 984 gigawatt hours total of electricity, and so that's around equivalent to a Dayton-sized city's annual consumption, electricity consumption, and the consumption from making chips, the electricity consumption has been growing, and it increased more than 3 times between 2023 and 2024. So in the training step, so first, so this is the step where you get some data, and so like I have a list here of some common open source data sets. So basically you get a bunch of data and then you give it to your model, and so you could actually do this on your own laptop or personal computer if you're not making a really big model. But these big companies, because their models are very, very large, very, very complicated, they use data centers where they can use many, many chips simultaneously. So these chips are what's known as graphical processing units, GPUs, or tensor processing units made by Google. Those are known as TPUs. So those are the ones that are manufactured in Taiwan. And so basically, the training step uses electricity because during this, while these chips need electricity to run, and then also the data center itself has also this auxiliary equipment for cooling, like other electronics. And then so basically you give the chip your data, it's like discharges its transistors many, many times, uses electricity, and then you create this model. And so one estimate of how much energy it takes is around 1 gigawatt hour, and so that's roughly equivalent to a neighborhood's electricity usage in a year. And I guess the relatively nice thing about training is that it doesn't scale with number of users. You make a model, you might have to train it a few times, and then you release it. So it's not really affected by how many users there are. And then the last step with inference, so this is the biggest wild card when it comes to AI energy use. So this is the step where you enter a prompt, and then basically a data center receives the prompt over the internet, and so that data center already has that trained model stored in their chips, and then so they run the model, and then and so in addition to the electricity needed to run the model, you also still have like the cooling, et cetera. And so, and then you get a response, and then you receive the response over the internet. So I wanted to give some numbers for the energy of common inference tasks. So I wanted to give it in reference to something that you are probably familiar with, which is your smartphone battery. So a smartphone battery is around 22 watt hours of electricity. So if you are generating text, one smartphone battery will get you 760 to 17,000 prompts. For image generation, your smartphone battery would only get you 10 to 120 prompts. And you'll probably notice that this is like a wide range. And so I got these numbers from Hugging Face's AI Energy Score leaderboard. So this is basically Hugging Face is this platform that hosts a lot of open source models. And so this leaderboard is, it's got a bunch of open source models and then companies that have submitted voluntarily the energy use of their models. And so you get this wide range depending on what model you select. And recently, Google released what their median prompt energy use was. And basically, one smartphone battery will get you around 92 prompts. So back to my beautiful slide, this image that I made. So this probably used around 10% of my phone battery. And it's an upper limit because I feel like this is not a very complicated picture. OK, so I wanted to give you guys a sense and see if you guys could answer a question given that information. So I guess with OpenAI has said that they have around 800 million active weekly users. So if we assume all those users, they each submit 10 prompts, and they're generating text. So how much energy would that use? And so I'm just going to have you guys answer this question in your head. So actually, maybe I'll have you raise your hands. OK, so 10 prompts, 800 million users generating text. Raise your hand if you think it is the energy usage of a neighborhood. Or several neighborhoods. OK, nobody's raising their hands. OK, how about a small town of around 6,000 people? OK, a couple people. All right, the energy use of Columbus. OK, some more people. Oh, all right, Ohio. OK, all right. Some people did not vote, but that's OK. OK, so I feel like we got sort of like a smattering for B, C, and D. The answer is actually A. It's actually it's around the weekly electricity usage of a few hundred people, a few neighborhoods. OK, and so all right, if you guys were paying attention, you can probably answer this question. So assume those 10 prompts from the 800 million people are now images. Would that use more or less? OK, more. Hands for more. All right. Anyone for less? OK, a couple for less. OK. So more, yes. So producing images takes a lot more energy than producing text. So can people say how much more? So 50 times? Raise your hand. OK. 100 times? OK. 1,000 times? OK, yeah, this was a trick question because there was a huge range. So it was kind of all of them. So, but I feel like the kind of the point of this exercise is to sort of just give you like a more intuitive ballpark in your head. I think for me at this point, I just like to think like around 50 to 100 times more for an image, even though it might not be absolutely true all the time. So. Yeah, so just to summarize, so right now text takes about a few hundred people. Like it uses up the same amount of electricity as around a few hundred people on a weekly basis. For images, it's more like a small city around Dayton size. And then right now there's been a push for a lot more AI video content, and so I wanted to point out that videos are just a bazillion images. So a lot of video is around 30 frames per second, so 30 images per second. OK, and so I also wanted to sort of recap just to give you guys a sense of scale for each of these steps. So for chip manufacturing in 2024, it was around the annual home electricity use in Cincinnati, so that's like 250,000 people. And then training a model one time is about the annual electricity of a neighborhood. And so like notably that's for training one time. So like there's all these different models. We don't really know how many times they train them. So yeah. And for inference, currently it's around the rate of the electricity use from a few neighborhoods to a small city. But this number is growing, and we kind of don't know how to predict it. So I wanted to then put those numbers in context with a global perspective. So that was more from a sort of individual ground-up estimation. And so the IEA found that data centers made up 1.5% of energy use worldwide. That's 415 terawatt hours, and that is about 10% of the US's annual energy demand. And so data center, so that was for data center electricity usage, but data centers do things other than AI. There was an estimate that found that AI makes up about 20% of that demand, but it is rapidly growing. It could double by the end of the year. And so I guess at this point, you might be wondering, okay, what does this all mean? Like, is this actually a problem? A few neighborhoods worth of electricity, like, do I need to care? And I guess I would say yes, you should care. So the thing is that, so the way that I've presented it at like an individual level, I've presented it at a global level, but like from those numbers, it kind of obscures what the problem actually is. The problem is this sort of it's a regional problem. It's like sort of this mid-level, mid-scale problem. And the problem is that, that companies build data centers in these very dense clusters. So they're very spatially concentrated. And so I'll give you this example of Northern Virginia. And so Northern Virginia has basically made a name for itself as the data center capital of the world. They've offered tax incentives since the 2000s for this. And then also there's just like a financial reason to build data centers in this way, because they can share infrastructure, they can share, electricity transmission, like water, like all this stuff. It's just easier for them to build like this. And so that has basically amounted to Northern Virginia now has 13% of global data center capacity and 25% of capacity in the Americas. And so I just want to harp on this because like Northern Virginia is like a particular region of one state in America. This is how spatially concentrated they have built data centers. And so, so right now in Northern Virginia, and in Virginia, there are approved data centers that have been delayed up to 3 years because they just don't have the electricity infrastructure for them. And there was this state commission report that found that it was pretty unlikely that they would be able to, power all of these by renewable energy. They found that they would have to build solar infrastructure at twice the rate that they did in 2024 to meet the new electricity demand from data centers. And so Northern Virginia is not the only place that has this problem. This is also a problem in Ireland. So data centers consume more than 20% of the country's electricity in Ireland, and most of these data centers are clustered around Dublin. And then there's also this other problem going on in the US where they're building a lot of data centers in desert areas like Reno, Nevada, also Phoenix, Arizona, where they lack water. And so like water is this whole other gigantic issue. So I'm not going to get into it here, but just know it's just as big of a problem and as complicated as energy. And so of course, if you have been reading the news, you also know that Columbus is courting a lot of data centers, and also there are a lot of data centers that have already been built here. And so, so there was a report recently that found that the data center capacity in Columbus grew by 18 times between 2020 and 2025. And then there have been announcements from the big tech companies that they are building more data centers around here. So Meta recently announced they want to build this cluster of data centers called Prometheus in New Albany, Amazon Web Services in Jeffersonville, Fayette County, And Google has a data center on Columbus's south side that it wants to expand, and there are more. You can find them, like the Dispatch has been covering them. And so I think one of the things about what's going on with data centers that is just really important to emphasize is just that there's just a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty about everything. It's uncertainty about how many people are going to use AI, uncertainty about how much energy it uses. And so most of the stuff I've talked about in this talk, I found through research and interviews that I conducted for an article I wrote for the journal Nature this year. And so one guy I interviewed was this guy, Jonathan Kumi. He's based in California, and he's an independent analyst. He's been studying energy and computing for 3 decades now. And so he summed it up like this. He said, "We're operating with very little detailed data and knowledge of what's happening. Nobody has any idea what data centers will use even a few years from now." And so if I were to sum up the problem, I would say, so the demand for data centers is uncertain because we don't know how popular AI is going to be. But the companies have a real incentive to push to build them right now. They have money, and they want to seem like they want people to think, they want their investors to think this technology is taking off. However, the local grid has limited electricity production and transmission capacity. And so they're building these data centers, and they don't have guaranteed electricity for them. And on top of that, these data centers don't actually create a lot of jobs compared to facilities of other industries, such as in manufacturing, because basically the most of the jobs that they create is during their construction phase. So once they're operating and running, they're designed to have as few people on site as possible. And so all of this is basically leading to a lot of local confrontations between communities and the companies building the data centers. And so I spoke with this nonprofit environmental group in Virginia called the Piedmont Environmental Council. And so they're very active in the area where they're trying to get more transparency for data centers. They're writing op-eds against data center projects. They're going to local city council meetings about zoning and things like that. And one thing I thought was very cool that they did is that they basically just mapped where all the data centers were and where the future data centers would be. And this is a very time-intensive process because they did this by sifting through government documents and newspaper articles. There isn't like a centralized way to get this information. And so I used it in my article, and so I was very thankful for it. So at this point, I wanted to go back to my original counter-narrative, which was about how AI is overhyped, so maybe we don't need to worry about its energy use. So I think I have tried to make the case that basically no, that this isn't a counter-narrative anymore. So because it doesn't matter whether or not AI is overhyped, it doesn't matter whether the technology is taking off, because these AI companies are already building these data centers. And so this is already straining local grids, and it's leading utilities to prolong fossil fuel plants that they were originally planning to take offline. And they're also building more fossil fuel plants, and so that's making it harder for companies to meet emissions targets. And so I think that AI is an energy-guzzling disaster in waiting, regardless of whether it takes off or not. And so I wanted to sort of spell out some possible trajectories that I see. In one scenario, let's just say that AI is as popular as the companies want it to be. Everybody wants to use it for everything that Sam Altman has ever dreamed of. And so in this scenario, I think it's pretty obvious, that's an energy nightmare. And actually, I think that what is true right now is that actually there's not enough energy for everybody to use it for everything that Sam Altman has ever dreamed of. And you can see this because like I was using the free version and it would cut me off. Like after I made like 5 images, it would just be like, you have to wait for tomorrow. And so you know, they know that they don't have enough energy for it. And you're already, so in this scenario, you know, they're gonna, if everybody wants to use it for everything, then they're going to have to build the data centers, but then they also need to build the electricity infrastructure to power the data centers, and so you'll see delays. And then because of those delays, there will be less incentive to retire fossil fuels, and so we'll have more reliance on fossil fuels. And so in the sort of opposite extreme, let's say that the AI bubble bursts. It has some niche applications, but most people forget about it like we forgot about Palm Pilots. So in this scenario, we're still left with the fossil fuel plants that we are currently rushing to keep online. And also, you know, they're building stuff right now. And so like power companies will still need to pay for what they're currently building. And so that means that they'll likely pass on those costs to customers, leading to higher electricity bills. And so these are, you know, sort of 2 extremes, and probably something in the middle will happen. But you know, either way, it doesn't look good for our energy needs. And so one possible scenario is something that's actually been reported on recently in China. So China too is rushing to build generative AI, and so they built hundreds of AI data centers to catch the AI boom. And it turned out they built them too early, or you know, maybe they won't need them. I don't know, but like you know, they're unused. And so in this scenario, like still somebody has to pay for the data centers that were built, even though they're unused. So I presented 2 depressing scenarios. I wanted to offer some points of optimism. So one is that we do have a say as individuals and local communities, and a lot of these data center issues are local issues. They have to do with, so like the companies will buy land, and that land needs to be rezoned. Like they have to apply for rezoning permits, and like these are things that are discussed at that you know, city councils discuss. There's also you know, things like how much of a tax break do we offer them locally, and so these are all discussions that we can participate in. And another thing is that I think company transparency would help a lot. So just if companies would just offer some more like ground truth of what is going on, like you know, how much energy and water do data centers use, some more statistics about you know, how users are using it, like how much of it is images versus video versus text, you know, that sort of thing. And then also the companies that make the chips, if they could also release more of that information, I think that would help in terms of planning electricity infrastructure and energy. It would improve it a lot. And so, so I'm not a policy person, and so I don't know how hard any of these steps are, but I wanted to offer some sort of ideas that I had that could that might be possible ways forward. And so one would be to have some sort of regulatory pressure, like have governments regulate data centers and require more transparency from them. We're already seeing a little bit of this in Europe and in some states. And then another thing is that, so basically the companies right now, their strategy for making their models better has been just like, let's make them as big as possible, let's make them use as many chips as possible, and like that's how we're gonna make them smarter. But actually there is this competing idea that is basically that when you do that, when you make these massive models where the intention is to give it as much general knowledge as possible, that actually basically like they become a jack of all trades, master of none. They're actually not very good at anything specific, and so actually maybe the way forward is to make smaller models that are task specific. And so these smaller models require less chips, and they are also they can actually require like orders of magnitude less chips. Like I was speaking to some people working in climate modeling, and they were saying like, yeah, like I think it was like several thousand times less compute power or something like that. So if we had more of a focus, if we invested more in smaller task-specific models, that could also reduce AI's energy footprint. Another would be to have more investment in open source models. So right now, one of the big problems is that like the big tech companies have all the power, and like this is their strategy. They're going all in on these huge models. But if you can have some other alternative to them, these open source models, maybe that could diffuse some of that power. And then also companies could stop automatically having users use AI. The one that comes to mind for me is the Google AI overview. So if you have been using Google lately, you'll probably have noticed that whenever you search anything, there's this thing that automatically pops up where it's basically their AI generation, their text generation. And so that actually, this AI-assisted search uses about 10 times more energy than a regular Google search. And then, so I guess for you as an individual, I guess I do think that this is like a systemic problem, and that basically I think the solutions will need to come from these sort of system level solutions. But in your own life, you could try. Basically, if you want to turn off AI overview in your Google search, you can type in -AI. I did this and it worked, but then I then learned that actually what it does is just, I think it deletes any mentions of AI in the searches. So like if you want to learn about AI, you can't do it because it'll just show up nothing. So and another option is like you can use Google and then you can just click on the web button, and then that will also get rid of the AI overview. And then I would also just say that to whatever extent that you can in your job, just to be curious or skeptical whether generative AI is really necessary. I think that a lot of workplaces are really pushing people to use it, but like they're just kind of throwing it at everything. I think you could do this in a smarter way. You could run some like pilot projects, or just don't use it if you don't think it's going to be useful. And I wanted to leave you with some resources. So as I mentioned, a lot of this stuff comes from an article I wrote in Nature earlier this year. It's called "How Much Energy Will AI Really Consume?" which I think I borrowed for this talk. So, and then also there's the International Energy Agency. I've read a lot of their reports. They're very long, but you can, if you want to know the source of the numbers, that's one source. And then there's a researcher based in Amsterdam, Alex de Vries. He's also done a lot of these estimates. And then Sasha Lucioni at Hugging Face in the US, and then Emma Strubel at Carnegie Mellon, and also the Allen Institute for AI. These are all places that have done a lot of good independent research into how much energy AI uses. And also, I leave you with my email and my Blue Sky. If anybody wants to get in touch, I'd be happy to hear from you. And yeah, with that, I guess I invite questions.
Okay, so I think we have time for several questions. Front row guy. Go ahead. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Eugene Beer with WGRN Community Radio Science reporter. I understand these NVIDIA chips that you showed a photo of. GPU chips, they take a lot of power, maybe an order of 1,000 watts. Do you have a number for that? Because normal CPU chips in desktop CPUs take about 100 watts, so a tenth. And you said the search for using AI is about 10 times more energy. But it looks like in those data centers, they have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of these GPU boards plugged in. So, yes, are they building any more plain old vanilla Google search data centers anymore? Or are they all going to be AI new constructions?
So there's still need for regular CPUs. GPUs are very good at very specific tasks. I had one guy describe them to me like they're actually really dumb. They just do one thing really, really well, and so they can supercharge like AI calculations. But like so I guess the answer is these data centers won't just have GPUs, but like GPUs are the thing that sort of make AI possible, and so there's a focus on that.
Okay, let's keep moving. Miss, I think it's a green shirt. Go ahead.
As AI advances more and more, will there be a point where energy problems stop the advancement of AI any further? What will happen then?
So please repeat the question.
Oh, yes. The question was, what will happen at the point when there's no more energy there's not enough energy to power AI? Is that what you're? If there wasn't enough energy. So if there wasn't enough energy, okay, so that's prohibitive. They will only, so if the grid doesn't have enough energy, you'll have all sorts of, you'll kind of destroy the transmission line. So they will forcibly cause blackouts or brownouts in order to prevent this from happening. And so basically, if they don't have enough energy, if they don't have enough energy, you'll see disruptions in electricity service. Yeah.
Let's go to the back there.
This might be a two-part question. So you mentioned if AI fails, there's not going to be a need for this energy, but we're going to have to pay more. Do you think the government will step in and regulate the energy production?
Wait, do I think that the government will step in and regulate what?
The excess energy produced for AI, for data centers, and will that impact the consumer? Second question, quick minister, is do you think the second revolution will come from the mechanical distribution of electricity through the chips, or from improved software development and programming, so that they reduce the number of transfers between the transmitters?
Okay, so the second question was about lowering the energy use of AI.
Yeah, lowering the energy use is it improved mechanical, between the transmitters, or is it improved coding from the AI?
Okay, so it is true that a lot of this is a big area of research which is reducing the making AI more energy efficient. So I think it has to come from both sides. It has to be both through software and hardware. One of the issues with this is that basically, as the more efficient a technology becomes, the tendency that social scientists have found is that people use it more. So the AI energy costs might be lower per task, but what will likely happen is that more people will use it more. I guess an analogy I would make would be if your AC was cheaper, maybe you would run it more, and that might end up using more electricity in the long run. So I don't think these technological solutions are going to solve the problem. And the other question was about government regulation. I don't know. I don't know.
Go ahead, young man.
So, as companies are trying to build these data centers and they're kind of running out of electrical infrastructure, such as, like you said, in Northern Virginia, when they're creating, are they creating new, solar plants? I know that we just got a major tax cut removed for building solar. So, are companies going to be creating or infrastructure outside of their facilities for the community, or is it they're just gonna slap a PowerPoint in there for themselves?
I think we're seeing more, like I saw an example, I think, of one of the tech companies, like they like build a dedicated power plant for the data center. I think it really just depends on the economics. Well, I think if it's financially feasible, like sure, there might be more renewable, but it seems like there's a lot more reliance on fossil fuels.
Miss, go ahead.
So recently at OSU, there's been a huge push for the use of AI in classrooms, where I think like a lot of classes are now requiring the use of AI, like regardless of like student opinion. Do you think that this is like a valid use of AI, regardless of like the energy cost?
I guess like I would have to like evaluate on a case by case basis. Like, is there like, can you give an example of how it's being required?
I think that like a lot of classrooms, like for some of the basic assignments, they say like you have to use AI as like a source, or have to use AI to generate something or other for this, or teachers are using it as like a tool to like help them teach or like answer questions or something.
So I guess like if you were gonna ask my personal opinion, I would say like I don't think that's a good use, but also I think it also is true that it's kind of something that's in the ecosystem, and like it is important that people learn its limitations, and maybe this is part of figuring out its limitations. If I were in charge of these things, like I probably wouldn't do it. But that's just my opinion.
Let's jump around a little bit. Young man, front row.
Yeah, so I have a question. So like, I remember reading an article in Khan Academy about Taiwan having like really fast internet. So like you mentioned that most of the GPUs are processed in Taiwan. So like, does it have to do with the fast internet speeds in Taiwan, or why is the reason that so many GPU chips are being processed in Taiwan?
Oh. I actually did not know that about Taiwan's internet. Oh, sorry. So the question was, so he read that the internet is really fast in Taiwan, and does that have to do with GPUs being manufactured there? If not, like why are GPUs manufactured in Taiwan? I am not sure I know the answer to this question. I know that like why does Taiwan build GPUs? So these facilities for making GPUs, there's like a lot. They're really hard. It's really hard to make GPUs, and it's really expensive. And so, I mean, Taiwan spent many years to, like building up this infrastructure, and so like they've made themselves known as this. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Okay, let's go back in the middle somewhere. Hat guy.
Cryptocurrency.
Also a big issue. I mean, and they're not always GPU driven because the crypto decryption algorithms are not really tensor based or matrix based. So I think the real issue is also crypto, the increased energy use. I work in AI, so I know this.
Okay. All right.
Can you repeat it a little bit?
Okay. So this gentleman had a comment that AI is not the only problem. Cryptocurrency is also a huge problem, and I agree. Cryptocurrency is also a huge problem. It uses a lot of energy when you mine cryptocurrency.
Okay, let's jump around. Let's see, other head guy.
Yeah, hi. So I'm a faculty member here at Ohio State, and I do research in AI. And what I hear talking to people I know in industry is that we're in an increasingly competitive arms race, right? So now they're talking about superintelligence, and the idea is it's going to be winner take all, or at least hardly, the companies that achieve superintelligence first are going to make all the money, or maybe China will make, will be the first to get there. And to characterize this, one of my academic friends, whose partner works at one of the major tech companies, he works in infrastructure, and his quote was, if you think you're building God, there's no time to document your code, right? So this is kind of, and there's no
no time to give statistics on data centers, or there's no time for anything, right? So I know you said you're not a policy person, but is there anything we can do, given the increasing corporate power in the U.S. and this attitude that they're in this increasing competitive race? Like, how can we possibly push back on that in ways that might be successful?
Okay, first try to summarize it a little bit.
Okay, so this gentleman was saying that he spoke with someone in industry who's saying that we're in this really competitive arms race, like both between companies and also between countries, particularly China, and that when you are in this sort of competition, it's really hard to stop and think about responsible use, be transparent. And he asked, what is it that we can do to sort of push back on this? I guess I don't have any answers. Like I would love if other people could offer ideas. Like I guess like for me, one of the reasons I gave this talk was because I was like, oh, I think I want more people in the area that I live to know about this. And so I think if there are opportunities in your life or at work where you can talk about this in a way that it might have an impact to do that. I don't know how, I'm not a policy person, so I don't really know what we can do on that sort of level.
Okay, oh, another hat guy, go ahead.
Awesome. Then it's sort of a question as part of research. I don't do any of this. What I do is I actually manage apartments, so I know what my electricity costs are. I know what my water costs are every single month. Electricity has gone up over 25% this region, this season. It's estimated in the dispatch it's going to go up another 30% in the next year. This is in part due to data centers. I know what the water prices have gone up and everything like that. AEP is a publicly traded company. Our water, the water from New Albany, which is Columbus Water, which also is the city. How would you go about finding the research? Because if Intel is going to New Albany in part because of water and electricity, and the other things, the data centers that are being built here are because of water and electricity. If we have a publicly traded company and our water is coming from Columbus Water, how would we go about finding out the differences that are pulled between us, the people, and the data centers and the companies for what they're using?
I think that's a really good question.
Okay. Summarize it a little bit.
Oh, sorry, I got to repeat it. Okay. So this gentleman was making the point that like water and electricity are public utilities. Where can we find information about how much of it is going to data centers versus residential use? I don't. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I think if you like look into, these companies put out reports. I'm not sure if they delineate that, and I am also not sure if they welcome feedback. I feel like this is something that would be nice. It would be great to know. Yeah.
No, it doesn't. But they accept it, but they don't accept. They don't want to hear it. So.
No, of course.
Okay, go ahead, sir. Yeah, right there.
Columbus Dispatch has a lead article today about data centers and how much water they use and how much electricity they use.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so this gentleman was saying that in the dispatch today, there's a story about data centers and how much water and electricity they use.
Okay, let's take just one more question. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. When you were giving your presentation, I was wondering, was it more about a climate change issue or the rising cost of electricity? It's going to help me ask my next question.
Well, I think that the climate change issue is of course very important. I focused on the electricity issue because it is a more urgent issue, and people seem to be more compelled by urgent issues.
Is the issue then, because this could be a question or a comment, then I'm taking, is the issue less about the amount of energy being used on the American grid, or is it also an issue about the lacking American infrastructure around able to maybe increase our investment and our power creation, just to summarize that, would this still be that much of an issue if data centers were popping up everywhere? Like in China, they have so many data centers that they're even leaving some, they build them and leave them closed, which is showing that they have probably cheaper energy production. So just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Okay, so the question was, would it still be as big of an issue if we just put more money into the electricity infrastructure? So I do think that climate change is a huge issue. I think that it's harder to like pinpoint. I think that if we did sink all this money into electricity infrastructure, there's still the question of like who pays for that, and then also like if it's not used, and like who pays for that, and so I think that it's I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it was just, I guess I was asking for your opinion.
Oh, my opinion?
Yeah.
Well, I guess like I could have given this talk from an emissions point of view. It's just that there's just a whole host of problems. I could have given this talk talking about water. I could have talked about money. I could have talked about like all host of things. I just isolated energy because it's so complicated, and so this is the particular problem with energy use.
Okay, so that's a great place to thank Sophia.